It's one of the most intriguing, complex, multi-layered paintings in the world, seemingly all about life, death, wealth, power, religion, music and astronomy. But what are the secret messages hidden in Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors, and why do aspects of the image still confound art historians to this day? In this episode of History Calling, we're going to take a look at this beautiful, baffling, and even creepy picture and discuss many of its most fascinating aspects, not least of which are the relationship between its sitters, were they friends or lovers, the presence of a distorted skull in its foreground, and how to correct the painting's optical illusion so that we can view that bizarre object properly. Before we dive in, please remember to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so you never miss an upload. You can also join my YouTube channel membership or find me on Patreon, Instagram and my Amazon storefront. Over on my website, historycallingofficial.com, you can even get 2 free downloads when you sign up to my mailing list, and those of you with Irish ancestry may want to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon. All the links you'll need are below for you. The Ambassadors is an oil on oak painting by the famed Tudor court painter, the German-born Hans Holbein the Younger. It was created in 1533 during one of his trips to England and measures 207 centimetres by 209.5 centimetres. The 10 oak planks which make up the panel were felled in 1515 or a little later. 1515 is the latest growth ring discernible on any of the 8 planks which were examined in the 1990s, and the tree came from the Baltic Polish region. The painting depicts 2 men standing on either side of a double-shelved table full of items, with a green patterned curtain behind them and a huge anamorphic skull on the floor between them, which cannot be viewed properly from the front. More on that later. Each leans an elbow on the top shelf of the table, and their poses roughly mirror one another. Until the late 19th century, their identities, along with much of the painting's provenance, had been forgotten. It was still known to be a Holbein, thanks to a faint signature on its lower left side, and it still had its title of the Ambassadors, but the rest of its story had become very obscure. It was only re-established based on internal evidence from the image itself and a documentary trail which showed that it had originally belonged to the man on our left. He was Jean de Dinteville, the French ambassador to England at the time, and his companion is George de Selve, Bishop of Lavaur. He was on a brief and semi-secret trip to the country between May and June 1533, giving us a very narrow time frame during which this portrait must have been planned out and the preparatory sketches for it drawn. After completion, it was taken to de Dinteville's home in Palissy, France, and hung on the walls of his house there, remaining with his family until 1653, before dropping out of view. It popped up again in 1787, being sold to a Mr. J.B.P. Lebrun, who then sold it on to an English dealer by 1792, after which it made its way into the ownership of Jacob, 2nd Earl of Radnor in 1808 or 1809, and was taken to Longford Castle. It was bought for the last time, so far at least, by the National Gallery in 1890, and now hangs there, opposite another of Holbein's works, his painting of the 16-year-old Christina of Denmark, Duchess of Milan and Lorraine, created while she was under consideration as the possible 4th wife of Henry VIII. I'll link my video about her on screen and below if you'd like to learn more about her life. Upon arrival at the gallery in London, the Ambassadors was found to be in pretty poor condition. Over the centuries, it had been dismantled and poorly reconstructed, so that the planks had warped. It had also been damaged by damp, coated in varnish, and badly restored, resulting in some of the detailing being lost. After an initial period of display, it was therefore taken down and restored again to late Victorian standards by the planing down of the warped boards so that they would fit together better, and the removal of the varnish, only to be replaced with a fresh coat. It was put back on display in August 1891. Unfortunately, thinning out the panels like that and placing the painting in the gallery, which was then much more susceptible to changes in lighting and temperature than it is now, made it vulnerable to further cracking and warping. These problems had become evident as early as January 1892, but in fairness to the Victorian restorers, they didn't know that that would happen and were following the established practices of the time. As the decades rolled by, the painting would suffer further splits and blistering of the paint, and had to be mended again in 1929, 1939, 1940 and 1952. Only when air conditioning was installed in the gallery in the 1950s did the damage dramatically slow down, now that the painting was not at the whim of environmental changes. Another restoration in the 1990s removed the Victorian varnish, which had obscured some of the darker elements of the painting, including the signature, which is very difficult to see even today. In fact, even standing right next to it, I didn't notice the signature on either of the occasions when I saw this picture. Nevertheless, by a happy accident, I did photograph it, though I've slightly clipped it because I was actually just aiming to photograph the floor detail. But I've circled it out here to make it easier for you to see, and it reads Hans Holbein, Pingabat 1533, meaning Hans Holbein painted this 1533. So now that we know something of its history, let's take a look at the ambassador's sitters and the other objects it shows in more detail, bearing in mind that my discussion of the painting shouldn't be viewed as all-encompassing. So much has been written about this artwork that it wouldn't be possible for me to discuss all the theories put forward about it in one video. This should therefore just be viewed as a selection of the available opinions about its many meanings, and if you want to learn more, I've left details of the sources I used for this video in the description box below. De Dinteville's outfit is expensive and showy, with the huge sleeves, slashed red or pink fabric, it seems to be satin, fur trim, which the National Gallery says is lynx, though I've also seen it called ermine, and a wide-brimmed hat with gold ornaments and a tiny little silver skull on it. Holbein's skills are on full display when we see how the delicate little hairs on the fur have been rendered, and there is also a meticulously painted tassel hanging below the dagger the ambassador clasps, complete with gold leaf detailing. He is dressed to impress, and this is the kind of fashionable garb that we also see on no less a man than King Henry VIII himself. In fact, this pose and outfit look quite like Holbein's later depiction of the king in the lost Whitehall mural, for which only copies and the original preparatory cartoon survive. Perhaps the ambassadors helped to inspire the later image of the monarch. We don't have any surviving drawing for the ambassadors, but infrared reflectography did reveal evidence of underdrawing on the painting, and additional underdrawing might be hidden beneath particularly dark lines of paint. It has also been suggested that this later drawing of an unidentified man is of de Dinteville, perhaps in the later 1530s. He was back in England in 1535, 36 and 37. Though it has also been claimed by some as Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, brother-in-law of the king. So really, who knows? De Selve, reflecting his position as a man of the church, is dressed in a less eye-catching yet still very costly outfit. It is a fairly streamlined dark brown robe of brocade, also trimmed with expensive fur, and with a pattern on the fabric, and was, according to Kate Bomford, who wrote about the painting in 2004, a form of smart but informal casual day wear. De Selve had not been consecrated as a bishop yet, though he had been appointed, and this is why he doesn't wear a formal churchman's outfit. Interestingly, the intention may have originally been that he be dressed in a brighter red, for during the restoration of the portrait in the 1990s, some flecks of such paint were discovered in the lower part of his robe. The reason for these two men opting to be painted together is unknown. They were friends, Bomford notes that de Selve's somewhat casual outfit even hints at this, and they were both French diplomats, but we can be certain of little else. Haggai Keenan, writing in Artibus and Historiae in 2002, postulated that they were actually romantically involved, pointing to a letter by de Dinteville written during this period in England, in which he expressed no small pleasure at the visit of de Selve in London, and asked that that visit be kept quiet from the Duke of Montmorency, who was the head of the King of France's household. There is also the fact that the French ambassador never married. De Selve, by contrast, wouldn't have been expected to, as he was a churchman. Keane then points to their body language as well as reflecting traditional ideas of masculine and feminine, like a marriage portrait. De Dinteville is on the left, taking a more active and important stance, with one foot forward and his hand on his dagger. De Selve is on our right, standing slightly back, clutching a pair of gloves and holding closed his long robe. We might compare their positions to the Arnolfini portrait, for instance, which also hangs in the National Gallery and which I had to fight through a crowd of Japanese tourists to get a picture of, or Christina of Denmark, who is likewise holding gloves. Countering this interpretation of a romantic relationship, though, we should bear in mind that de Dinteville expressed his unhappiness at his English posting in the same letter mentioned a moment ago, so a visit from a friend would of course have been a pleasure to him. Plus, de Selve's visit was semi-secret, which would explain the desire to keep it quiet from Montmorency, and if the two men had been involved in what would have been an illicit relationship, would either have been stupid enough to flaunt it in a manner like this painting. Bomford picked up on the masculine-feminine body language too, and the similarities to well-known portraits of husbands and wives, but she interpreted these features as a sign of friendship and nothing more, adding that the diamond rings, which can be seen in the pattern of the green curtain behind them, were also a sign of matrimony, but in this case have been transformed to represent the bonds of friendship. She noted other cases where such rings were exchanged between men for platonic reasons, such as one given by Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio to Erasmus of Rotterdam in 1519, and said that there was, quote, a lack of established pictorial conventions for the representation of friendship at this time, which would help to explain why the conventions of marriage portraits were used instead. In that case, de Dinteville would have been given prominence as the older, more experienced man, and the one who was paying for the painting, explaining his more masculine pose. The truth is, though, that we'll probably never know the real reason behind this seemingly unusual pairing. Even more perplexingly, historians and art experts have also struggled to understand the collection of objects worn by or surrounding both these men, most of which were rare, expensive, open to different interpretations, and even apparently designed to confound the viewer. A few items at least are quite straightforward to understand. The hilt of de Dinteville's dagger tells us that he was in his 29th year at the time this portrait was painted. It says AT, meaning Aetatis Sua 29. His age is 29. And the Order of St. Michael of France, which he wears around his neck, indicates his membership of that order and his nationality. In a similar vein, the book on which de Selve's elbow rests, which was probably a Bible in reference to his line of work, informs us that he was Aetatis Sua 25. These were some of the details which helped to re-establish the sitters' identities, as did the terrestrial globe on the lower shelf of the table, which marks de Dinteville's home of Palissy in France. This further confirmed that he was the original owner of the painting. So far, so good, but very little else is this clear-cut. The tabletop is covered with a piece of expensive Turkish carpet, and on the top shelf we see a celestial globe and a variety of mathematical instruments. The first thing to note is that these were real objects, not imaginary ones, and they are mostly state-of-the-art items for the 16th century. We can even surmise that Holbein or de Dinteville had borrowed or bought some of them from the king's astronomer, the German-born Nicolaus Kratzer, who Holbein had painted back in 1528. Why can we surmise this? Because they appear in Kratzer's picture as well, and these weren't the kind of objects that most people would have had lying around. The chances that someone else had them and would be willing to loan or sell them to the French ambassador or to Holbein are low to nil. They aren't even common items to own nowadays in the age of mass production. So what, if anything, is Holbein, in conjunction with de Dinteville and de Selve, trying to communicate to us with these objects? The celestial globe, which depicts the heavens, has aroused considerable discussion. It represents astronomy, one of the 7 liberal arts, and shows the constellations of Hercules, Draco, Lyra, Cygnus, Delphinus, Pegasus, Cepheus, Cassiopeia, Andromeda, and Perseus. Does it show something of astrological rather than just astronomical importance, though? Mary Hervey, writing in 1900, thought not, citing the opinion of the then Astronomer Royal. Hervey did add, though, that the presence of a bird, seemingly a rooster, which is apparently attacking the other birds in the image, represented, quote, the onslaught of France upon her foes, and their ultimate downfall and flight. This is because the rooster was an ancient symbol of France. She also claims that the word Galatia next to the bird is meant to be Galena, for this means rooster. However, Ellie Decker and Kristen Lippincott, writing in 1999, claim that this word should actually be read as Galaxia and refers to the Milky Way. Hervey and the two later authors also disagree on the template for this globe. Hervey acknowledged that the painting will have been based on a real item, but did not speculate on the origins of that item. Decker and Lippincott assert, though, that the original was definitely created by the mathematician, astronomer and geographer Johann Schoner, because he was, quote, the only globe maker practicing during the early 16th century known to have produced woodcut celestial globe gores, and internal evidence in the painting to do with how the little stars on it are rendered suggests that the original globe copied by Holbein was made of wood. Gores, by the way, are the curved sections of wood or whatever material is being used, which are fitted together to make a spherical shape. There are other indications that the painting has copied a Schoner globe, including the empty hand of Perseus and the depiction of Cassiopeia with a crown of thorns and holding a sickle. There weren't many celestial globes being produced in this era, and the fact that these details, which were unique to Schoner's designs, reappear in Holbein's work is a strong indication that one was a copy of the other. Decker and Lippincott do acknowledge differences in how the constellations have been labelled by the two men, though, which might suggest that the globes are not linked after all, but they posit that Holbein was simply copying a version of a Schoner globe which has now been lost to time. They also argue that, quote, Holbein's celestial globe has been set to indicate the terrestrial latitude of 42 degrees north, which, according to contemporary tables, was the latitude of Rome. This is important because it rules out the possibility that the globe is meant to represent the date at which the painting was created in London. The only other possibility they acknowledge is that, quote, whoever set the globe in its stand inadvertently used the complementary scale on the meridian ring. If this is the case, then the intended latitude was 48 degrees north, the latitude of Paris, and more importantly, of de Dinteville's hometown of Polisi. The globe further indicates a specific time and date of 2:40 p.m. on the 12th of July, but no meaning has as yet been attached to this, for it doesn't match up with the birthdays of either sitter. The cylindrical object is a pillar or shepherd style, and is meant to tell the time and date, but only when placed in sunlight. Here, however, it is indoors, yet still has shadows on it to indicate a date. Eric Ives stated in his biography of Anne Boleyn that it shows the 11th of April, the day Anne was recognised as Queen in 1533. But when I watched a video about the portrait by the National Gallery, its host, Susan Foister, Deputy Director and Director of Public Engagement at the Gallery, stated only that it could show either April or August, with April being the preferred option in her opinion, given what we know about when the portrait was created. So there is some dispute here about what we're looking at and what we're meant to infer from it. Decker and Lippincott say that it shows either the 10th of April or the 15th of August, and that the shadowing on it, quote, defies the laws of optics, and makes it impossible to say with any certainty what time is meant to be shown. Moving on, to the right of the pillar we have a universal equinoctial dial, which is shown in two parts, but which would have been used to work out the time. We don't know why it is disassembled, both here and in the portrait of Kratzer, in which it also appears. Next, we have an orrery quadrant, which is the white item tucked in behind the equinoctial dial. It is sitting on its side and showing multiple times of the day, so that it doesn't appear to refer to anything specific, or if it does, we can no longer unpick its meaning. Then there's a polyhedral dial, with 3 of its sides on clear display and a 4th partially shown. This would have been used to tell the time. Annoyingly though, despite the clear shadows which have been painted onto it, it actually fails to do this in any clear way. Two of its sides show a time of 10:30, while another shows 9:30. The spread of the hour lines is incorrect, and the little compass you see set into the top of the dial indicates that it is not pointing in the correct direction for it to function anyway. If this dial is meant to be telling us something specific, we aren't getting the message. Finally, for this top shelf, we have this astronomical instrument above de Selve's elbow, called a torquetum, which the Oxford Reference Dictionary defines as a medieval instrument for measuring the position of an astronomical object in either equatorial, ecliptic, or terrestrial coordinate systems. However, not enough of it is shown to display anything specific, and Decker and Lippincott write that Nicolaus Kratzer must have given Holbein a rudimentary version of such an instrument to use, and that its appearance in the Ambassadors is an important signpost marking a specific step forward in the history and dissemination of scientific learning during the Renaissance. For de Dinteville, it also showed his first-hand acquaintance with the cutting edge of European scientific thought. Moving down to the lower level of the table. Here we see the terrestrial globe underneath the celestial one, and indeed beneath all the items designed for examining the stars, just as Earth is beneath the heavens. It is seen upside down when the painting is viewed normally, but to make it easier to discuss, I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees so that you can see the details on it more clearly. We already know it marks out Jean de Dinteville's home, and Paris is there too, though the city's name is spelled with a B at the start. Susan Foister hypothesized that this might be an indication of Holbein's accent when he spoke French, and how he thought words were pronounced and spelled. It is based on a real item which has been speculated to be another globe, or rather published images of the globe, belonging to Johann Schoner, and which was known to have existed in 1523. Certainly some of its internal information suggests a creation date around that time. It is an accurate rendering of the planet as it was known in the early-ish 16th century, and crucially the presence of two little ships indicates the route taken by the Spaniards when they circumnavigated the world between 1519 and 1522, and so it cannot predate their return date. The fact that Holbein was painting it in 1533 means the original globe had to exist by then, giving us an 11-year range in which it was made. Still, the association with Schoner has been disputed, due to differences in cartographical knowledge between what is shown on the Holbein globe and what appears on other globes known to have belonged to Schoner as late as 1533, and the fact is, we aren't really sure what item Holbein modelled this image on. The prominence given to the city of Nuremberg on it does at least suggest that that is where it was produced though, and it includes a line set by Pope Alexander VI to divvy up the New World between the Spanish and Portuguese. We can see the words Linea Divisionis Castellorum et Portugalum written on the globe as well. Around 100 names found on an original globe by Schoner also match up with the Holbein version, but there are some interesting additions too which tally with places important to de Dinteville, such as Policy, Paris and Lyon, where he had lived and worked, plus Languedoc, where his cousin was the governor. The globe is therefore in many ways a map of his life and career. The lower level of the table contains a lute as well, with its 6th string broken. Mary Rasmussen, writing in the journal Early Music in 1995, argued, in line with earlier historians, that this represents some sort of harmony which has been disrupted, with the break in the 6th string being particularly noteworthy because 6 was seen as a perfect number. Next to the lute is a case of flutes, with 1 missing. These 2 items, or group of items in the case of the flutes, represent the liberal art of music, but the missing flute has a deeper meaning, again suggesting the lack of harmony in Europe at the time thanks to the upheavals caused by the Reformation. Many of the other items also make religious allusions, and the painting contains a mix of Catholic and evangelical references. 1533 is a bit early to talk about Protestantism as we know it today. A music book sits open on the table, near to de Selve's ankles, but while he was a Catholic churchman, this is a Lutheran hymn book by Johann Walther. It shows a translation by Martin Luther, father of the Reformation, of Veni Sancte Spiritus, meaning O come Holy Spirit, and the 10 Commandments. Both these texts, which do not appear next to each other in the original publication, were common to the Catholic and Reformed faiths, suggesting reconciliation between these two different branches of Christianity at a time when they were moving further and further apart, often violently so. They are written in German, which was of course Holbein's native tongue, and the placement of the book might reflect de Selve's known interest in healing the splits in Western European Christianity. We also see a partially open book of German arithmetic, with a set square acting as a bookmark and a set of dividers tucked away behind it to our right. The page is a copy from a book by a man called Peter Appian and discusses division. Is this another reference to the religious divisions across Europe? Looking down to the floor, we see it is a geometric mosaic. I've speculated that because it is a cosmati pavement, and the only other such pavement in England is the 13th century example in Westminster Abbey, where Anne Boleyn was due to be crowned just a matter of weeks after this portrait must have been begun, this is another reference to the Queen. It was supposedly included because de Dinteville had been invited by Henry VIII to attend the coronation, something Ives calls the high point of the ambassador's career. But I have to say that I'm a bit sceptical about this, as the two pavements are far from identical, and surely if the point was to reference the coronation, Holbein would have copied the Westminster example exactly. As Kate Bomford says, the floor wouldn't have been recognisable to most of the intended viewers of the painting either, who would have been living in de Dinteville's native France, and the inclusion of this type of flooring in it may have just been, quote, to complement the overall richness of the composition and demonstrate Holbein's skill in the depiction of a complex pattern in receding perspective. You're free to disagree, of course, and perhaps it is a backhanded reference to Anne. Also on the floor, we can see the lute case tucked away beneath the table, but the most noticeable thing of all in this lower section of the painting is the anamorphic skull in the middle of it, which appears completely distended when viewed from the front. Anamorphism is an optical illusion which distorts the perspective on an item, and we can see another famous example of the technique in this slightly later picture of Edward VI, which is in the National Portrait Gallery in London, just next door to where the ambassador's hangs. It resolves, when viewed properly, to look like this. For many years prior to the painting's restoration, which revealed the skull in better detail, no one even realised what the ambassador's skull actually was, and at one point it was even suggested by one scholar that it was a fish. Thankfully, we do now recognise it for what it truly is, though resolving it is rather tricky. You can view it from the right-hand side like this, though you'll need to hold the camera up above your head, and even then it's not 100% fixed. I could have done with a stepladder myself. Or alternatively, you can view it from the lower left like this, though you will have to get right down on the ground in front of a room full of people whilst feeling like a complete idiot. I speak from experience. We know from an inventory that the picture was hanging in the first floor grand salle of the Chateau of Palissy in 1589, but we don't know exactly how it was presented, and of course it may have been moved around different locations in the house over the years. Perhaps it had a little ladder next to it, or was at times presented on a staircase so that 16th century viewers could see the skull properly. Maybe they were even given a little glass viewing cylinder to look at it head on and see it correctly in that way. For you though, if you're viewing this video on a handheld device or even a laptop, it is quite easy to resolve, even if I show you a direct view of it like this. Just look at your screen from the right side and tilt it so that you're looking down on the skull, or look at it from the lower left of your screen. You may want to pause here for a few seconds so that you can get the perspective right. The skull posed a considerable challenge for the 1990s restorers, as it was quite badly damaged underneath the layers of varnish and repaint, but they reconstructed these areas as best they could and pointed out in an article about the restoration that their work can be easily removed if desired. Why is the skull there though? There are numerous possible explanations. It resembles the one on de Dinteville's cap, and it is the only motif in the picture to be repeated. Mary Hervey said that de Dinteville had likely seen Holbein's Dance of Death series of images, completed by 1526, though not published until 1538, the last of which is called The Arms of Death, and which features a skull like the ones seen in the ambassadors. De Dinteville in this theory then adopted the skull as his personal badge, thus its double appearance in the painting. This, she says, was partly because the ambassador was always ill, and, quote, the vision of death hovered constantly before his eyes. Another theory holds that it is meant to show the ultimate pointlessness of worldly knowledge, represented by the many scientific, mathematic, and musical instruments present, for none of mankind's knowledge can stop death. Or does it show that death is the great leveller, coming for both a nobleman and a bishop and ending their friendship? Another idea is less pessimistic, that the skull symbolises the ability of friendship to last beyond death, for it is at the feet of Jean and George as though they have beaten it, and of course the painting itself has given them a kind of immortality. As you can see, there is no consensus on what to make of the skull's presence. Next, we come to one of the most easily missed items on the whole painting, which is a small silver crucifix tucked away in the top left corner of the composition and nearly hidden by the green damask curtain in the background. It was in fact completely hidden by varnish and overpainting prior to the 1891 restoration. This symbol of Catholicism is surely meaningful, especially when placed in such stark contrast to the Lutheran motifs in this painting. And it is interesting that Holbein, presumably in conjunction with his client Jean de Dinteville, chose to have these symbols of two different forms of Christianity in the image. By including it, the artist has also paired death, represented by the skulls, with the idea of the resurrection and afterlife, giving the viewer a sense of hope rather than despair at the prospect of this life ending. Mary Rasmussen also claims that it is no accident that the skull is resolved when you stand to the left of the painting, directly under the crucifix. However, given that you can also resolve the image by looking at it from the top right, I'm not convinced by that argument. The painting would also need to be displayed exceptionally high up for you to be far enough below the skull to see it properly from the left. Remember that I had to get right down on the ground to make it resolve in this way. Had it been hanging up high enough for me to view the skull in perspective from my standing height, I doubt I could have made out the tiny crucifix anymore. Returning now to the curtain. Though Holbein certainly used curtains, even green curtains, in other images, such as his portraits of Thomas More and Sir Henry Guilford, this one is huge, taking up the entire background of the painting. The most basic reading of its presence would be simply that Hans liked a green curtain, but there seems to be far more going on here than that, and its presence and size suggest the wealth of de Dinteville and also that it is dividing two realms, with the living in front of it, the dead behind it, and the crucifix traversing the two and representing the way to get from one to the other through the redemption offered by Christ. Heike Keenan postulated in 2002 that the possibility of a reality existing behind the curtain is underscored. That is, instead of defining the interior bounds of the scene, establishing a clear limit for the viewer's gaze, the curtain suggests the presence of a depth beyond itself. So to sum up, The Ambassadors is doing many things. On one level, it is a painting of two men created by an artist at the height of his powers who is showing off the sitter's wealth and position and his own ability to create a wildly complex image. On another, it is telling us about de Dinteville's life and career with its references to locations associated with him and his skull device. On yet another, it is an image all about a hoped-for reconciliation between Catholicism and Lutheranism, as well as the contrast between life and death and the possibility of salvation. It may even include references to the marriage and coronation of Anne Boleyn, and to the sitter's known interests in what was then cutting-edge science and theology. Most of the items in it are copied from real objects, but several are disassembled or assembled incorrectly to the point that they would not have functioned. This leaves us unable in several cases to use them to tell time or work out specific locations. Why they have been presented in such a fashion remains a mystery. Bomford speculates that the presence of so many instruments related to timekeeping was meant to suggest the passage of time and mortality, but perhaps Holbein just didn't know how to set them up correctly before painting them. Whatever the explanation behind the myriad of objects observed here and the interpretations which can be extrapolated from them, one thing seems certain. The Ambassadors will continue to fascinate viewers for many centuries to come. I hope you found that overview enjoyable. Let me know what your favourite aspect of the ambassadors is in the comments below, and if you're in an art history mood now but aren't sure where to go next, might I suggest either my art history playlist or my video on the anamorphic portrait of Edward VI. If you specifically want to go on a Holbein bender though, then I would direct you to my video all about his life, or another on his portrait of Anne of Cleves. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.